this today's meeting, let me welcome warmly David Litwa, an expert on early Christianity and the religions of ancient Mediterranean. He's an expert on Gnosticism, on heresiology. He has written a number of important papers and important books on aspects of Gnosticism, heresiology, early Christianity, well, today he's going to contribute to this meeting on principles. We shouldn't forget that our sort of meetings this year focuses on principles in late antiquity. He's going to talk on the three principal systems of the refutation of all heresies. So David, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm thrilled to be able to present this information and this paper to you all, and very much warmly welcome feedback. I must apologize again to our North American friends who aren't able to join us, and hopefully you'll catch the recording, but you have my apologies. I will soon be joining you in North America, so apologies for bending toward Australian time here. But today I will actually be contesting the three principal systems of the refutation of all heresies as a category. It was in an influential anthology published by Werner Forster that we find this category of Gnostic texts called the Drei Prinzipien Lehre, or three principal systems. And for Forster, these included the reports on the Naassenes, Monoimus, Simon of Samaria, the Peratai, the Sethians, in both the account of the Refutator and Epiphanius, as well as the Archontics of Epiphanius and the Doketai. I will pronounce it as Doketai, not Docetists. They are quite different. Now, when one examines Forster's introductions, and I'm referring to his text called Gnosis, a selection of Gnostic texts, first published in German and then in English, and I believe in other languages, one sees that Forster gives very little explanation for this three principal category and why these figures actually fit the category. Nevertheless, his categorization seems to have stuck in the minds of at least some scholars. For instance, in his widely used handbook on Gnosis, Kurt Rudolph categorized Naassenes, the Sethians of the Refutation, and the paraphrase of Shem as three principal systems. And in 2007, Berger Pearson included the Naassenes, Peratai, Doketai, Sethians, and the paraphrase of Shem also among three principal systems. And the Italian scholar Maria Grazia Lancelotti, in her monograph on the Naassenes, also grouped them together with other so-called triadic systems. Now, the problem with the three principal system category is that it tends to reinscribe the heresiological classification put forward by the anonymous author of the Refutation of All Heresies. As many of you know, I do not call this figure Hippolytus or pseudo-Hippolytus. I will simply refer to him as the Refutator. Now, he was the first person to urge that groups in his Sondergut, including the Naassenes, Peratai, Sethians, Justin, author of Baruch, Monoimus, and the Doketai, upheld three principles. And the Refutator well knew what a philosophical principle or archai was, as he gives in his very famous and still worth reading doxography in book 1 of the Refutation. An archai is a source or productive cause of reality. Yet the Refutator, I believe, often played fast and loose with his language. Whenever he saw 3 entities in his source material, he tended to portray these entities as full-blown philosophical principles, even when they were not. In fact, it seems that the Refutator went out looking for 3s in his sources. Since the Refutator was the one selecting the material for his reports, he could load the deck, as it were, by emphasizing 3 principles whenever he saw triadic terminology in his sources. Now, a great example of the Refutator's approach is his treatment of Apelles, disciple of Marcion. Although the Refutator was well aware that Apelles posited one singular good God, he portrayed Apelles as a believer first in 4 gods, among whom are the good, the creator, a fiery god, and an evil god. And for good measure, in book 10, his final summary, he threw in a 5th god, Christ. Now, this language is more than a little perverse, because the Refutator was well aware that Apelles didn't call the creator God, and explicitly called every being less than God an angel. Accordingly, it's important to bracket the Refutator's framework in order to independently examine the evidence of the 3 principal systems in the Sondergut. So I'll begin with the Naassenes, and I'll just provide the Greek text and translation in my edition here. Feel free to offer suggestions and corrections. When the Refutator began his report, he stated that the Naassenes worshipped 2 beings, the human and the son of the human, both called Adamos. And in this way, Naasene Binitarianism hits the reader on the nose. Yet, as we find out, Adamos is soon to be divided in 3 ways. And here I think Adamos refers specifically to the son of the human. The son of the human is triply divided, but the triple division is not a division into 3 principles. Or so I think. There are 3 aspects of the son of the human: intellectual, animate, and earthly. One subsequently learns that there are 3 kinds of people in the universe, namely angelic, animate, and earthly, resulting in the creation of 3 churches. Yet this latter division is anthropological. The 3 types of humans who make up the 3 churches are neither theological nor cosmological principles. They are actually sociological groups in the mind of the Naasene author. So where then is the evidence for 3 principles in the Naasene report? Well, in the Refutation 581, when the report is about half complete, the Refutator paraphrased the preacher, quote, "The one who says that all things are composed from 1 errs, but the one who says that all things are composed from 3 speaks truth and will give the exposition concerning the universe," unquote. Now, this is an excellent example of the Refutator highlighting triadic language, even when it doesn't refer to principles. The preacher here was not talking about sources or causes of reality, Archai, but about entities that presently constitute reality as we know it. As he clarified, there is a blessed human above, mortal human nature below, never called a principle, and redeemed humans rising to heaven. In simple terms, the preacher distinguished the human, namely God in his system, and 2 sets of earthly humans, the saved and the lost, to put it most simply. And when he spoke of the human, he didn't distinguish the human from the son of the human, as we saw at the beginning, since he wasn't making a statement about the Godhead, the source of reality. The preacher, in short, was making a remark mostly about types of humans, since these types of humans are not and are never called principles. In my opinion, it would be erroneous to understand the preacher as promoting a three-principle system on the basis of this text. Now, Kurt Rudolph added here that the term principle, actually, when he translated this text, he added that word, principe or principle, even though the term doesn't appear in the Greek. To quote here, the one who says that all things are composed from one principle errs, but the one who says that all things are composed from three principles speaks the truth, etc., etc. And in the end, I mean, there are no principles in the Greek text, but in the end, Rudolph counted four principles, which are the three principles in the Nicene Psalm and the Nicene Creator, named Asaldios as the fourth. Let's take a look at the Nicene Psalm. As many of you know, this appears at the end of the Nicene report, and in particular, its first three lines. The songwriter, who is not necessarily the Nicene author, distinguished a first intellect, protos naos, outspread chaos, kuthen chaos, and a soul in third place, tritati psuche. And here I think the Refutator wanted his readers to understand three principles, and some modern scholars have followed him, as we've seen. But somewhat confusingly, the psalm also presents an entity called the firstborn, prototokos, such that chaos is the second diphtheros after the firstborn, and chaos is in turn followed by soul. So technically, I count here four entities, unless we identify the firstborn with soul. But apart from this ambivalence, the key point is that, once again, the Nicene psalmist never identified soul, chaos, and intellect as principles, archai. Accordingly, I don't think that we as modern scholars can safely redescribe these entities as principles without some rationale based on the whole scheme of Nicene thought. And I would be prepared to admit that if we wanted to translate Nicene theology into philosophical terms, the intellect, which we could say represents the human, the soul as the son of the human, these might be called principles, theological principles, but I don't think that chaos can be called a principle in the Nicene system, at least as a source or cause of reality. Based on the Nicene use of chaos in 579 and its later use in the Psalm, where the fragmented soul seeks to flee bitter chaos, I take chaos to be a term for fluctuating matter. Matter is inert and dead without the organizing energy of the son of the human, and at best, chaos is a cosmological principle, essentially different from the two theological ones, the human and the son of human. Now, I fully admit that the Refutator presented Hesiod's chaos as a divine principle back in Book 1, but one must distinguish the Nicene use of chaos from the Refutator's interpretation of Hesiod. Even if Hesiod meant chaos to serve as a principle, this would imply nothing for the preacher, who never cited Hesiod in the surviving report. Again, the goal is to step out of the Refutator's polemical framework to read the Nicene discourse on its own terms. What about the Nicene use of spirit or pneuma? Surely this is another third principle. The preacher did refer to a virgin spirit who bears an eternal child. And in my view, however, this spirit, is not an independent agent, but is rather another name for the Son of Human, who as a piper breathes his harmonious spirit into all human minds. So to sum up, this is a tangled mess of data. And there are, to my mind, when you wade through it, actually only two clearly stated principles in Nicene thought. That is the human and the son of human. Forster was right that there was, in his language, a monistic aspect in Nicene thought as well. Human and son of human are, after all, one consubstantial being called Adamos. Accordingly, I think the preacher would have agreed that all things come from Adamos, and that Adamos, in the end, is the single source and principle of true reality. Let's look at another text in the Refutation of All Heresies. This is the famous and contested Great Declaration, or Apophasis Megalene. In this case, Forrester admitted that the Great Declaration begins, to quote him, on a note of monism, where we see that fire is the cause of all. Probably some means some kind of intellectual fire. But as we move on, we find 6 principles called roots, symbolized by the 6 days of creation. This account is a hexameron. These roots are topped by a 7th power. And in 618, which is the longest excerpt from the declaration, the emphasis is on the first 2 powers of the 6 roots, namely mind and thought. And in my view, to isolate then 3 principles from this theological maelstrom is more than a little arbitrary. Which 3 entities do we actually choose, and why? Now, I fully admit that in 614.2, the Simonian author notes that there were 3 days before sun and moon, and that these 3 days hint at mind and thought, plus the 7th power. The author even commented, quote, "These are the 3 powers that arose before all others," unquote. But the others, or by the others, I take him to mean the other 4 powers, which include voice and name, reasoning, and conception. He could not have referred to the ultimate principle, which is called both fire and silence, which existed before all 7 powers. Here, being precise is important. The 3 powers that are singled out here are not called principles or roots. They are not the only powers in play. Accordingly, I think it's erroneous to say that the Great Declaration proposes a 3-principle system. When scholars claim that the Great Declaration puts forward 3 principles, perhaps they think of the distinctive phrase, "The one who stood stands and will stand," one of my personal favorites. Now, this is another name for the 7th power, who can be conceived in 3 moments. The 7th power stood above with the unborn power, presently stands in human beings as the divine image, and will stand when the human being is made according to the likeness. Yet does this theology amount to a 3-principle system? Again, I don't think so. The 7th power, even if we call her a principle, is not the only principle or power in the cosmos. The fact that she has 3 aspects, forms, or aeons in 617.2 does not mean that the entire Simonian system is governed by 3 principles. It's far from clear, at any rate, that the Great Declaration represents a 3-principle system. What about Monoimus? This figure, unfortunately not well known, was an Arab theologian, perhaps from the area of modern Jordan. And he is perhaps the quintessential Christian Neo-Pythagorean. He was fascinated, one might even say obsessed, with numbers. And like the Naassenes preacher, he seems to have posited 2 original beings, the unborn human and the son of human who was born. The human is the transcendent number 1, while the son of human is the monad, the actual number 1. But this monad is not paired with a dyad. The monad is instead likened to an iota, which represents both 1 as a single stroke and 10, since it symbolizes 10 in the numerical system. Like the Simonian author, Monoimus referred to the 6 days of creation as 6 powers plus a hebdomad, and these powers from 1 to 7 are said to emerge out of the monad. Monoimus spent a great deal of time discovering decads in the Septuagint, and even Forster admitted that overall, this, quote, gives the appearance of a monistic scheme, unquote. Quite ironic, because he's categorized as a 3-principle system. And this monism, again, Forster here, is not harmed by the fact that there's also a God of creation in the Monoimus report. Is he also a principle? Let's look at the Peratai. And here, I think one can perfectly understand why someone would categorize Peratic theology as a 3-principle system. The Peratai reportedly taught that the world was one, though it was divided in 3 ways. It could, we are told, be infinitely divided. Yet the primal division was threefold: a fatherly greatness, a mass of self-generated powers, and the particular or material cosmos. At the end of the report, the refutator puts it more simply, quote, "The universe consists of Father, Son, and matter, and each of these 3 contains infinite powers," unquote. Now, this sounds, interestingly, very much like the refutator's summary of Plato's supposedly 3 principles in the opening doxography. For Plato, there is God, mind, and matter. Yet here, again, complications arise. Is the Father really part of the world, the cosmos? It seems not, since the Father is transcendent and not particular. The world would have to be used in a very broad sense to mean everything that exists. Even then, a Peratic might still insist, like Plato, that the Father is beyond being. When the Peratai use the term Archai, and they do, they said that the principle was one, Mia, even if divided 3 ways. This would imply that the threefold division does not refer to principles. Another Peratic use of Archai refers specifically to the sun, who is also depicted as the constellation Draco. He, quoting the Peratics, is the great principle, or beginning, possibly, about whom it is written, "In the beginning was the Logos," unquote. As for the material or particular cosmos, this is never called a principle and is not in any way like the Father and Son. If any entity should be called a principle, it's probably the quote-unquote ruler and artificer of matter in 517. But again, this entity is not really a source or cause of reality, just an organizer. Lastly, some of the refutator's evidence is simply not relevant. He seized upon the idea that there were 3 gods, 3 logoi, and 3 humans. What the Peratai meant, apparently, was that gods, logoi, and humans were assigned to each of the 3 divisions. Gods, logoi, and humans are not principles. If they were, we would have to conceive of 9 principles for each of the 3 gods, logoi, and humans assigned to the 3 divisions. Finally, I'll just note that Jesus was triple-natured, according to the Peratics. But again, this isn't evidence of a 3-principle system. It's a Christological statement. Accordingly, although it is reasonably clear that the refutator wanted to make Peratic theology seem crystal clear as a triadic system, he was, in my view, massaging the data in a particular direction. Let's look then at the Sethians, by which I mean the Sethians in the refutation. The refutator remarked that the Sethians have 3 clearly defined principles in the universe. And these principles are light, darkness, and an intervening spirit. This system seems very simple until, once again, other characters begin to appear in the report. The first is the mind shaped in various forms, otherwise known as the perfect God. This being is trapped in human bodies and hastens to be freed. The second character introduced is the lower father, who fathers yet a third being, called a ray from perfect light. Then comes the perfect logos of light, who enters the creation in snake form. So, what do we do with these four other characters? Are they principles in the same or similar way as light and darkness? Does the lower father imply a higher father not mentioned in the report? Is the higher father identical to light or another being like the light from the light? In the end, what the refutator presented as a clear-cut three-principle system is, in my view, hardly clear. Of course, he mentioned three entities whenever he saw them, but not every set of three denoted three principles. Accordingly, the fact that there were three persons in paradise, as well as two sets of three sons, Cain, Abel, Seth, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, this can't tell us about three principles. The three patriarchs that are mentioned in the report, as well as the 3 days before sun and moon, and the three types of laws certainly make the reader think of threes. But once again, does this really make Sethian theology into a three-principle system? One gets the sense that here, especially, the refutator was delighting in finding triads in the report. But his own understanding of Sethian theology as involving three principles seems hasty and simplistic. Almost done. The Doketai, truly an unsung group, appears in Book 8 of the Refutation. This group reportedly likened the primal God to the seed of a fig tree. They distinguished three parts of the fig tree: the trunk, the leaves, and the fruit. These three parts represent three aeons, which arise from the first principle, apotes, protes, archis, and these three aeons are in turn called ton, halon, archai, principles of the universe. The question arises whether this is a one or three principle system, or maybe both. There is a primal principle and then three principles of the universe. The three derive from the one and are not said to be consubstantial with it, even or if the various uses of principle are used in the same sense as they are here in 885, perhaps we should call this a four-principle system. Probably, however, the first principle is ontologically superior to the three later aeons. We are told, after all, that God himself remained by himself, far separate from the three aeons. The three aeons emanated an infinity of aeons, and among these was a distinct set of 30 aeons. These other aeons cannot all be principles in the same sense as the primal God. To make matters more complex, we're told that the three aeons became one and gave birth to a mediating aeon called Savior. I'll also throw into the mix the great ruler who makes the material cosmos. Once again, therefore, it seems rather precipitous and reductive to categorize Doketic theology as a three-principle system. To conclude, as has long been noticed, there are many small and superficial similarities in the Sondergut reports. Yet when one studies them in detail, they all appear significantly different. If the devil is in the details, then the scholar must dance with the devil to make any sort of progress here. To be sure, the refutator wanted to simplify matters to confirm his claim, stated outright, that all heresies derive from a single and satanic source. He believed that they were all basically the same system, just remodeled with different words and names, as he says in the Naassenes report. And I think it's safe to say that the refutator was mistaken in that judgment, and therefore we should be wary of his polemical categorizations. So what can we actually conclude after our more rigorous analysis of the reports? The systems of the Naassenes and Monoimus do not, in my judgment, involve three principles at all. Both seem to be basically binitarian. The Peratai, Doketai, and Sethian systems might be said to involve three principles, but they also involve many other entities, which might just as well be called principles. The Doketic, Naassenes, and Monoiman report also seem to have definite monistic tendencies, a penchant, that is, for reducing everything to a single source. I conclude then that calling any of the Sondergut theologies three principal systems involves us in an unhelpful reductionism and a reinscription of the refutators' heresiological categories. Nothing that I can see perfectly unifies these systems, which all present a host of varied similarities and differences when compared against one another. And it's best to take them all on their own terms and describe them with as much detail as we can. They do not come from the same source, satanic or otherwise, and each should be treated as independent systems in dynamic interaction with each other. I will end here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, David. That was great. I very much appreciate that you have gone into all these interesting details, which so many of us did not know, but at the same time, you somehow posited a number of sort of, at least to my mind, important general questions about principles. Well, the floor is open for discussion, questions, remarks, objections are all welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, just a general question.
Mm-hmm.
Do the three principles involved here have something to do with the three, the triad in porphyry of being, living, thinking, and the three hypostases of Plotinus? How would that relate to that?
That's a great question. So all of these systems I take to be earlier than both Plotinus and Porphyry. I would date most of these systems to late 2nd and early 3rd century. We have an end date 222, approximately the death of Bishop Callistus of Rome. So presumably all the systems are earlier than 222 of the Common Era. So it is clear to me that most of the figures I've discussed are readers of Plato and are Platonists of some sort. And it is true that Platonists, based on Plato's letters, they did sometimes refer to threes, the famous great king of all passage. But what we have is, nothing that I would describe as any kind of genetic connection. There are some things which look surprisingly like what one could say foreshadowings of the great Plotinian system. And I would be very willing to entertain that some of these systems were Alexandrian and that they were in the same cultural and philosophical stream as Plotinus, who received his education in Alexandria. But beyond that, I don't have the expertise in Plotinus to say much else. But thank you for your question.
Thanks.
Yeah, Dylan, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, David, for a wonderful talk. I'm so glad you did this. Frankly, I had no idea, basically, that the theoretical basis for the grouping of the three power systems was so weak. And I mean, you demonstrated this amply. This is a category, and we can let that go. So I'm thankful for this study, and I'm looking forward to the published version so I can cite it and engage it. So terrific work. This relates actually to Joseph's question. I think one of the really interesting and important things your talk does is raise this question of what qualifies as an archai anyways.
Exactly.
Right? And so this came up. I first thought about this closely as you discuss the Naassenes Psalm and the description of chaos there. It's inert matter, right? That it's not a cause of the intelligible world, but it exerts some form of causation in the physical world, and so it's cosmic. It's literally a cosmic cause in some way. So my question to you is it useful to designate also physical causes as opposed to intelligible or transcendent causes from a Platonist perspective? Archai? And how are we, what are we to do? How do you negotiate this question of valuing, on the one hand, in the ancient evidence, explicit designations of something as an archai, and on the other hand, taking this emic use, this native term from the sources, and using, as historians of religion and philosophy, the term archai to designate some of the principles of causation that we see in these systems. How you seem to me to incline towards the former approach, really sticking to an analysis of the native terms rather than appropriation of it. But how did you see this problem shaking out in your own exploration of this material? Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Dylan. Yeah, really all that I'm trying to do in the talk is just to show how varied and complex the material is and how superficial and reductive the classic scholarly categories that were introduced in the 20th century. It is a jumble and a jungle. And yes, when a volume is published, you have very careful definitions attending both to emic and etic category or our frameworks should be in play. Because in this source material in particular, there's a great, it's all mixed up. You have Christological principles, theological principles, cosmic principles, anthropological principles, ecclesial principles, and threes come in at all 5 different levels. There's 3 churches, there's 3 people, there's 3 aspects of Christ, there's 3 aspects of God, and there's 3 causes of the cosmos. I mean, you got it all in a jumble. And the unfortunate thing that the refutator does is, because he's so 3 happy, I'm not sure that's a term, but because he probably wants to depict all of his opponents as debased Trinitarians, he seizes upon 3 and doesn't distinguish whether he's talking on the Christological or the theological or the cosmological or the anthropological or the ecclesial level. And so it's the job of the scholar to come in and say, okay, let's maybe make some distinctions. And, we're very thankful that the refutator wrote down as much as he did, but there's also things missing. So we have to do the job. It's harder for us because the reports are now spotty and paraphrastic, and we have to do a better job than the refutator who actually had the full text. So That's quite a challenge. I think, yeah, in the end, we're not going to be able to do this solely on an emic level. That is, we're not going to be able just to kind of say, well, here's what the Sethians of the Refutation meant by principle, because they never come out and say that. And even if they did, the refutator didn't bother reporting that. The refutator is a philosopher of his own right, and he tries to impress and wow his audience with his amazing doxography in book one, and then he just, plows right into the sources. and so he's using his own categories to talk about things. But yes, occasionally, I think he does report that, for instance, the Peratics use the term principle. And so occasionally, then you could say, okay, well, here's probably what the Peratics meant by that. Yeah, where do you go from there? I mean, ultimately, I think you're also going to be forced to say, what do we as scholars mean by principles? And does it make any sense to use the emic terminology, especially when we've got 8 different reports in the Sondergut, and they could all be possibly using it in a different sense. That's the harsh complexity that we face. So it's an uphill battle, and I'm definitely going to need help from other scholars to make any sense of this.
May I ask a follow-up question, George?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
sure. What do you make of the title that is given to a number of cosmological treatises of antiquity, most famously that of Origen, Periarchon? This is, of course, a formula that is used for a text that would espouse a form of monism, right? And yet plurality, archon, is integral to the title. How to deal with what does the set of evidence, the use of this title to designate monist systems, or you could argue henotheistic systems, tell us about Archai terminology in this period, perhaps with relevance to your discussion of Apelles, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I haven't given that much thought to book titles. That's an interesting way into this. There was a famous debate depicted by Eusebius between Apelles and Rhodon, who's Tatian's disciple. And Rhodon says to Apelles, "Come on, just tell us what you think. There's one principle?" And Apelles says, "Absolutely, there's one single good principle of the cosmos. That's what I've always said." Okay. And then Rhodon says, "Okay, now prove it." And Apelles is like, "You don't prove that sort of stuff. You that's just intuitive. You accept it or you don't." And then Rhodon has a big laugh. But absolutely, these Christian authors, they're able to use the terminology for a variety of entities which could exist below the primal entity. And I think that these Christian authors of the late second and early third century are writing a philosophical wave toward monism. I mean, if caught in an alley and threatened, do you believe in one God and one principle? I think most of these people would say, yes. I mean, it's only when they're at their desk and they have time to philosophically work it out that they start multiplying. And I mean, they start talking in sophisticated ways about these emanations, which also might be identified on some level ontologically or consubstantial, to use the Naassenes term, with the first principle. So, yeah. They're all in the same discursive field, all heading toward monism, I think.
Thank you so much, David.
Yeah, Joseph.
Hello. Yes, I've just been looking at John Baer's edition of Periarchon of Origen, and it's very interesting. There weren't very many texts that used that Archai language perhaps something by Apuleius, one or two things like that that Origen might not even have known. And he does, at the beginning of that text of Origen, there's a sort of quotation from Plato, from the Gorgias, which kind of is a kind of a nod to Plato, and he is trying to use Platonic things, but the Archai are not philosophical at all. They're the items of the creed. And it's true that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit lead the list, but it goes on. It includes free will, for example, or it includes angelic beings. And therefore, it's a kind of a subversion of the Platonic notion of Archai, because the Archai are concrete data given by the creed rather than philosophical layers of reality. And that text, I'm not sure, probably you said 222 as the cutoff date for these triads you were talking about. But the Periarchon is a very early text of Origen. I'm not quite sure what date exactly, but maybe 230 or something like that. So put that there for what it's worth.
Yeah, that's helpful. They're roughly contemporary, and I don't think we can expect from Christian authors, even of those of a philosophical bent, the stability of meaning in their use of Archai. Yeah, I think that's helpful that they just mean the elements of the creed, which, I mean, I guess you could ask, why didn't they call their works, peristoikeon or something like that? I mean, the basic elements of faith, or yeah, I think probably we have to face a fairly wide semantic usage of Archai in early 3rd century. It's I mean, maybe it's could be a synonym of kephalion, perikephalion, what the main points. I mean, I don't know. I'm just
but also it's possibly the very first effort of a systematic theology, because before that you had apologetics, where the issue was to defend the Christian fact, where the data against objections. And you have the stromatase of Clement of Alexandria, which is a kind of a chaotic production, as far as I could see. Whereas Origen is trying to think systematically. So in that sense, he's inspired by Platonism. And he admits it somewhere in the text that he's boldly using the kind of wisdom of Platonism to order his thoughts. And yet he's not writing a philosophy. He's not a philosopher. I disagree with people who call Origen a philosopher. So, and I think it's a very original title, Periarchon. I don't think he had a predecessor within the Christian world at all, which is perhaps one of the reasons why the text was considered innovatory and disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also, not to be flippant, but I think we also just need to pay attention to the rhetorical value of a term, as well as its philosophical burden. He certainly wanted to give the impression. I mean, Origen also wrote a stromata, which is unfortunately lost, but I think in the Periarchon, he certainly wants to give the sense that it's a very neatly defined and rigorous philosophical treatise, and that must have sounded like a very rhetorically high register title.
Well, thanks a lot. Well, it seems to me that sometimes, perhaps, when people talk about sort of Archai, they mean they refer to conditions or necessary conditions, not sort of efficient causes or fundamental causes, but necessary conditions for the existence of whatever, like the world. It's sort of unclear how people sort of conceive of Archai, and what David has presented today somehow underlines exactly that.
Well, I hope so. Yeah, it's all a rather mixed bag in these sources. That's certainly true.
Well, at least when Platonists at that time speak of causes, they mainly refer to the Timaeus and sort of the demiurge and the forms and the receptacle, and how the three somehow relate to each other. But exactly, the Timaeus shows that monism is sort of possible, even if you accept sort of three causes or three principles.
Right. Yeah, and I think again there's a section on Plato in the Refutation Book 1, and we can't expect it's a doxography. We can't expect much philosophical sophistication, but yes, it's God, matter, mind, and the Refutator emphasizes those three principles, and I doubt he would be much open to moving that into a monistic direction, although I think another Platonist would want to nuance that and not make that such a rigid.
Does the mind here stand for the place of logoi?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's a doxography. All we have is the lemma, which is stripped down to the bare bones, and that's the kind of philosophy that the Refutator delighted in, because he could simplify and use reductive versions of things, and then foist them upon his Christian philosophical enemies. So, yeah, I mean, as a student of the Refutation, unfortunately, I feel like we can't delve deeply into philosophical, accuracy and nuance. But I think definitely, yeah, you could, if you were speaking to a genuine Platonist writer of the time, of which there are many examples.
Or to Origen later on, a little bit later on. Well,
sure.
Who speaks of sort of patterns and logoi.
Also, the Timaeus, the Timaeus is perhaps the most important text of Plato in the 2nd century. And you see the kind of archai it has. They don't form a trinity. There are three different instances. There isn't a hierarchy in which they are organized properly. So in a sense, the Timaeus shows the state of archai thinking in the Middle Platonist time. And it's only with Neoplatonism that the Parmenides comes along. The notion of the one begins to dominate. And the notion of a hierarchy in the first hypothesis and the second hypothesis of the Parmenides forming the kind of backbone of Neoplatonism. And Origen is before that. Origen is still in the Middle Platonic sphere, I would say. And this notion of archai, it's an effort to organize things in a more reasonable way by calling them principles, or causes, which really didn't catch on. I mean, I don't think later Christian texts talk about archai. I don't know, are there any other Christian texts after Origen that use the word archai in the title or even as a major concept? I just ask.
Yeah, I'm sure someone much more knowledgeable of late antiquity than I could answer that.
I mean, it's something to look into. The page on Lampy provides a lot of evidence regarding theological and philosophically tinged usages of the term. I'm not seeing a designation of something that would describe the articles of faith as Joseph, I think, very acutely points to the beginning of on first principles. And I like this reading very much, Joseph. It's one to add to an MP or one to write into our own copies, an additional usage. The closest I see is a description of logical premises of argument, which may be Origen's point, right? My premises for talking about cosmology are a little different because I'm not only admitting Plato and Aristotle as bases for reasoning, I'm also admitting scripture. And I'm about to show you what you can do with scripture, reasoning from that. But I think to further explore other titles, I feel like there are many, but we should go look for them. Is one way to go about it. Yeah.
We have to go back to Philo of Alexandria too, because he's the first one to bring the Timaeus and the Logos, the idea of the Logos, into the philosophical idea of the Logos into connection with his view of Scripture. I mean, David Rooney has a lot of material about that, how Philo rewrites the Timaeus in a biblical way, or he writes the Bible in the Timaean way.
Yes, that's true. I just saw David yesterday, actually.
Oh, amazing.
George,
Any
would
final
you...
points? Well, sorry, Dylan, go ahead.
No, I had a question for you.
Please.
Would you? I mean, this is relevant for Philo too. Would these sort of negatively tinged causes that later Platonists take really in the sense of privation,
right?
Like the indefinite dyad, or say the receptacle understood by Middle Platonists as matter, would these qualify as archai? Is it useful to think of them as causes, for example, as causes of chaos or evil or the like?
Yeah, well, I think I think some people do see this as principles. So a principle does not have to be necessarily benevolent or, so to speak. Well, it has to be sort of to be contributing to the final result. In a way, and the indefinite dyad, if it stands for matter, it can be something chaotic, but still through the cooperation, the collaboration with sort of God or the intellect is a necessary condition for the coming into being of the world. So that's why I'm saying that some of those principles maybe just sort of sufficient, well, necessary conditions for the coming into being or for the existence of something.
It's a passive principle, rather than an active one.
Absolutely, yeah. Right. Well, people distinguish between passive and active principles in the wake of the distinction in Stoicism. But, the Stoics distinguish between a passive and an active principle, but they still sort of call them both, or think of them both as principles, so the topoion and topaschon.
It just strikes me that in the Christian writers, the locus of discussion of Archai in a cosmic sense would be commentaries on the Hexameron, on the the 7 days of creation, because that's where Gregory of Nyssa and Basil and Augustine are most engaged with thinking of cosmic principles, of the principles of the cosmos, which are not only God as a creator, but also things like angelic realms of mind, which kind of are intermediary between God and creation, things like that.
Yeah, if we can also, I mean, I think the Simonian Great Declaration is a hexameron, and it has been faulted in the past for using mythological language, but this distinction between mythological and philosophical, I think, is more than a little conflicted. But instead of archai, it will use risa, or root, and I think that's been talked about here in these sessions before, that the author will prefer a particular residence, and so he, possibly she, says that there's 6 roots corresponding to the 6 days of creation, but those are, I would take as, if he was speaking in a more philosophical register, I would think he would simply say Archai, 6 Archai, plus a 7th, which he adds and calls the 7th power.